Hello, welcome to the Self-Learning Podcast by Dr. Sushma Singh. Let us start discussion on Chapter 8, Social Movements, and our topic is Ecological Movements. For much of the modern period, the greatest emphasis has been laid on the development. Over the decades, there has been a great deal of concern about the unchecked issue of natural resources and a model of development that creates new needs that further demands greater exploitation of the already depleted natural resources. This model of development has also been critiqued for assuming that all sections of people will be beneficiaries of development. Thus, big dams displace people from their homes and sources of livelihood. Industries displace agriculturists from their homes and livelihood. The impact of industrial pollution is yet another story. Here we take just one example of an ecological movement to examine the many issues that are interlinked in an ecological movement. The Chipko movement, for an example of the ecological movement in the Himalayan foothills, is a good example of such intermingled interest and ideologies. According to Ramchandra Guha, in his book Unquiet Woods, villagers rallied together to save the oak and the rhododendron forest near their villages. When government forest contractors came to cut down the trees, villagers, including large number of women, stepped forward to hug the trees to prevent their being felled. At stake was the question of villagers' subsistence. All of them relied on the forest to get firewood, fodder, and other daily necessities. This conflict placed the livelihood needs of poor villagers against the government's desire to generate revenue from the selling timber. The economy of subsistence was pitted against the economy of profit. Along with this issue of social inequality, villagers versus a government that represented commercial capitalist interest. The Chipko movement also raised the issue of ecological sustainability. Cutting down natural forest was a form of environmental destruction that had resulted in devastating floods and landslides in the region. For the villagers, these red and green issues were interlinked, while their survival depended on the survival of forest. They also valued the forest for its own sake as a form of ecological wealth that benefits all. In addition, the Chipko movement also expressed the resentment of hill villagers against a distant government headquartered in the plains that seemed indifferent and hostile to their concerns. So, concerns about economy, ecology, and political representation underlay the Chipko movement. Now, the next topic is class based movement. The first one is peasant movements. Peasant movements or agrarian struggles have taken place from pre colonial days. The movements in the period between 1858 and 1914 tended to remain localized, disjointed, and confined to particular grievances. Well known are the Bengal Revolt of 1859 to to 62 against the indigo plantation system, and the Deccan Riots of 1857 against moneylenders. Some of these issues continued into the following period, and under the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi became partly linked to the independence movement. For instance, the Bardoli Satyagraha 1928 Surat district, a non-tax campaign as part of the nationwide non-cooperative movement, a campaign of refusal to pay land revenue, and the Champaran Satyagraha 1917 to 18 directed against indigo plantations. In the 1920s, protest movements against the forest policies of the British government and local rulers arose in certain regions. Recall our discussion on structural change in Chapter 1. Between 1920 and 1940, peasant organization arose. The first organization to be founded was the Bihar Provincial Kisan Sabha 1929, and in 1936 the All India Kisan Sabha. The peasants organized by the Sabhas demanded freedom from economic exploitation for peasants, workers, and all other exploited classes. At the time of independence, we had the two most classical cases of peasant movements, namely the Tibhaga movements in 1946 to 47 and the Telangana movement in 1946 to 1951. The first was a struggle of sharecroppers in Bengal, in northern Bihar, for two-thirds share of their produce instead of customary half. It had the support of the Kisan Sabha and the Communist Party of India CPI. The second directed against the feudal conditions in the princely state of Hyderabad and was led by the CPI. Certain issues which had dominated colonial times changed after independence. For land reforms, zamindari abolition, declining importance of land revenue, and public credit system began to alter rural areas. The period after 1947 was characterized by two major social movements, the Nexulite struggle and the New Farmers movement. The Naxalist movement started from the region of Naxalbari 1967 in Bengal. The central problem for peasants was land. You have a clear understanding of the sharp divisions within the agrarian structure in rural India from Chapter 4. Many of the agrarian problems persist in contemporary India. Chapter 4 has discussed these in detail. The Nexul movement is a growing force even today. The so-called New Farmers movement began in the 1970s in Punjab and Tamil Nadu. These movements were regionally organized, were non-party and involved farmers rather than peasants. Farmers are said to be market involved as both commodity producers and purchasers. The basic ideology of the movement was strongly anti-state and anti-urban. The focus of demand were price and related issues. For example, price procurement, remunerative prices, prices for agricultural inputs, taxation, non-repayment of loans. Novel methods of agitation were used, blocking of roads and railways, refusing politicians and bureaucrats entry to villages, and so on. It has been argued that the farmers' movements have broadened their agenda and ideology and include environment and women's issues. Therefore, they can be seen as a part of the worldwide new social movements. Now, let us wind up the session and thank you very much for engaging yourself with the Self Learning podcast.